What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another New York Giants video. And in this video, I'm joined by a very special guest and a excellent colleague of mine who loves his New York Giants, Kyle Russo. You've been on the channel before. Kyle, how's it going tonight?
It's going good, Tom. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great. And I'm really excited for what's in store over this next week with free agency upon us. And we have a lot of moves to talk about. The Giants made 3 roster moves today. And before we dive into that, folks, make sure to go follow us on Big Blue Avenue at Instagram, Twitter, and our YouTube channel at Big Blue Avenue. Put up a nice video and tribute to Riley Dixon yesterday after he got released. And I didn't even mention this in the Riley Dixon video. They cut him 5 days after he got married. So, poor guy. Hope he's having a happy honeymoon. But we're here to talk about Kaden Smith, Kyle. The Giants waived Kaden Smith following a failed physical. This comes a week after the Giants released Kyle Rudolph. And, of course, we know Evan Ingram and Levine Toilolo are both impending free agents. So the Giants seem to be clearing their entire tight end room out. This move actually saves $2.54 million in salary for the New York Giants. Smith was scheduled to make that exact amount last season. And, you know, you and I were talking before the video, Chris Myrick, really the only tight end of significance remaining on this roster. I know the Giants have Jake Houseman and Rice and John, but those are both practice squad future players. With Kaden Smith, he joined the team as a waiver claim in 2019, 2 days after being cut by the 49ers. The 49ers selected him in the 6th round of the NFL draft that year. In 3 seasons, Smith played 33 games with 22 starts, 12 of them coming in 2020. Giants ran a lot of 12 personnel. And through his 3 seasons with the Giants, 52 catches, 413 yards, 3 touchdowns. Kyle, what went through your mind when you found out that Kaden Smith was waived today?
Well, what went through my mind is that essentially when you break it down, they wanted to keep him, barring a physical, pending physical. And because he wasn't able to recover from that injury that he suffered last year, because last year you barely saw him on the field. I think he only had like 3 catches last year. And this is a young guy. And when you see the likes of Levine Toilolo not coming back, you see that Evan Ingram probably is not going to be back, especially Tom, because I don't know if you've heard about it. Some teams are trying to recruit him as kind of a receiver type guy, which means that he'd be making more money elsewhere than considering a tight end spot, which I don't think the Giants would want to give him that receiver money, especially in the cap situation that they're at right now. So with all that, Kaden Smith was essentially going to be the number 1 tight end as far as we were concerned. Obviously, a whole free agency and draft to get through. But at this point in time, that was going to be tight end number 1. Obviously not, barring a failed physical. So a little bit of a shocker, but like we've kind of come to the consensus and conclusion, there's going to be a lot of moving pieces, especially within these next coming days, as I would assume the Giants, Joe Schoen, what he's been pressing all offseason long, he wants to get as close to that $40 million mark. It might be a little bit of a stretch, but maybe around the $30 million mark with the next couple of days, because you want to go in with as much money as possible in free agency. That way you don't limit yourself and have to scramble in the draft, even though they have as many picks as they do. You want to make sure you prioritize what you can in free agency and then going to the draft kind of comfortably. So,
Absolutely. And before we talk about what the Giants might do at tight end in free agency and in the draft, I just want to highlight a couple of Kaden Smith statistics. We mentioned he was brought over in 2019. That was his most productive season when Pat Shurmur was the head coach. That offense he was very successful in. He came in the same year as Daniel Jones. They were technically the same draft class, even though Smith was drafted by a different team. Smith played in 9 games with 6 starts, had 3 touchdowns that season, nearly 300 receiving yards. And Kyle, if you remember, he was the one that caught that game-winning touchdown in overtime in that Washington game. He had 2 of his 3 touchdowns that game, infamously known as the Chase Young game. And the following week, he recorded a career-high 8 catches and 98 receiving yards against the Philadelphia Eagles. It was very unfortunate that when Joe Judge became head coach, when Jason Garrett became offensive coordinator, it seemed like Kaden Smith was a little bit of an afterthought as far as the receiving game goes. In 2021, Smith played 9 games with 4 starts, only caught 3 passes, as you mentioned, 2 of them in week 2 against Washington. And that knee injury he suffered against Vegas back in week 9 I mean, he never fully recovered. They placed him on IR in early December. He never came back from that. And it's a shame because over the past 2 seasons, he's developed as a strong run blocker. And I think he had a lot more upside receiving wise than the Giants knew. But, best of luck to Kaden Smith. This is probably the one cut so far that really has been like, it doesn't sit too well with me, but
Yeah.
we'll see what they do.
It doesn't sit well because now we don't know what the future of the tight end position holds for the Giants at this point in time, because as much as, Chris Myrick might have played the second half of the season, it's like, is that really tight end number one going into the season next year?
No, exactly. And I'm looking at this draft. The Giants have 7 high draft picks, right? They have one very early in the 4th round. And I believe the Giants have 6 draft picks within the first 2 days of the draft in 2022. What do the Giants do at tight end? I think you and I were sort of in an agreement. You want to get a tight end 2 in free agency, and you want to draft your potential tight end of the future in this year's draft. I'm thinking maybe 3rd or 4th round. I know you really like Jeremy Ruckert out of Ohio State.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Jeremy Rucker. I'm a Long Island guy. I've been a Long Island guy my entire life. He went to high school at Lindenhurst High School. So to see that kind of story develop, because he went to high school around the same time as me. I think we're around the same age. To see that story kind of develop, a kid from Long Island going to one of the biggest football schools in the entire country, Ohio State, to make it to the NFL and then come home to play for the New York Giants would just be such a tremendous story. But Tom, like you alluded to, there are definitely some options in free agency. I've kind of been looking a little bit, not too many, huge names out there, but some veteran-like presence. Maybe an Eric Ebron. He kind of came on the scene with the Indianapolis Colts a while back when he was connecting in the end zone with Andrew Luck. He had a tremendous year that year. Moved to Pittsburgh. They kind of fell out of the lineup due to their receiver depth in which they had. And now after drafting a Pat Freiermuth, he's a free agent. He's not going to be resigned. That could be an option. Maybe a Hayden Hurst, obviously, as the Atlanta Falcons with the 4th overall selection last year, drafted a Kyle Pitts. I don't expect him to be back. Or maybe even a Mo Alley Cox. Obviously, Jack Doyle just retired for the Indianapolis Colts, and they might want to retain him as much as possible, try to increase the amount of weapons that they have, because as we know with the Indianapolis Colts, as great as Jonathan Taylor is, as great as Michael Pittman Jr. is, after that, it's a tremendous fall off. And along with Jack Doyle, T.Y. Hilton could be retiring too, so they might want to retain as many guys as they can. But Mo Alley Cox, he's got freak athleticism. He's got great hands, and when you give him the opportunity to catch the football, some great things happen. So that could be a potential option, just as a second tight end, or maybe a number one up until that tight end, in which I think they will draft, whether it's a Cade Otton or a Jeremy Rucker or a there's one out of Texas A&M or Eastern Carolina, I believe. Likely, I believe his name is Isaiah Likely, who's a great tight end as well. I think they definitely draft one, but I would not be surprised if they sign a veteran tight end, like any of those guys who I think that you can get at a cheaper price, maybe around the $4 million, $5 million marker, especially guys like a Eric Ebron and Hayden Hurst, who on their both respective teams completely fell out of the lineup.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the Ruckert part of your argument for the draft. I think he would be an excellent player to draft. I've done a few mock drafts. He's been going mid to late 3rd, early 4th. I think he's likely going in the 3rd round. I think that would be a great spot to take Jeremy Ruckert. I believe the Giants have 2 3rd-round picks. And 2 other names in this draft that I personally really like. You mentioned Cade Otton and Isaiah Likely. I'm going to add 2 more into the mix because that's how deep this tight end class is. I'm going to go Trey McBride out of Colorado State. I really like him a lot.
He's
I know
really
he only had one touchdown, but he had over 90 catches and 1,100 yards. And Charlie Kohler. I really like him too. I think he'd be a good fit on this football team. As far as free agency goes, I mean, I like Hayden Hurst and Eric Ebron that you brought up, but the 2 that I think would be the best fit as a potential tight end too, Tyler Kroft, former Buffalo Bill, and Tyler Conklin. Tyler Conklin is a guy who was forced to be the tight end 1 for Minnesota this season after Irv Smith had his season end before it even began, sadly. And Conklin did a nice job, a guy who's primarily known as a blocking tight end who can catch the ball at times, and he did respectable in that department. I think that's the type of guy the Giants were looking for. I think he fits that mold, or maybe even a Max Williams from the Arizona Cardinals. I think that could be an option as well. That guy's a big dude. So
Yeah.
I think it'll be interesting to see what the Giants do in free agency. But in my opinion, I like Ruckert in the draft, and I would love to get Tyler Conklin in free agency if they can swipe him away from the Minnesota Vikings. So
Yeah, that would it
yeah.
would be a good one. Another guy that I was thinking of that kind of fell out of my mind a little bit when we were talking about it. OJ Howard. I
Oh
remember
yeah.
back in 2017, that's who I wanted at the tight end so badly, and they wanted to fall into Tampa a couple picks right before the Giants picked Evan Ingram. So that would be a huge tight end acquisition. The problem with OJ Howard throughout the entirety of his career, he's a good player, but he's just never healthy. And then when he finally got healthy, Tampa Bay's receiving core and tight end core was so deep that he just completely fell out of the lineup. When you're tight end number 3 behind Rob Gronkowski, arguably the greatest tight end of all time, and then Cameron Brate, who's been pretty solid since he's entered the league, there's no really room for you to grow in that position. And then on top of the fact with the receivers you have there, with a Mike Evans and a Chris Godwin, and they had a Scotty Miller, and they had Antonio Brown for a little bit, and then a bunch of other guys as well. So you kind of fall out of that position. But if he could be retained there, because again, another costly, effective tight end, that would be a good option as well, because I think he still has great athleticism, and I think he could still be a really good tight end if given the chance.
Other news for the Giants as we wrap up our tight end discussion. Familiar faces coming back. Sills Army. David Sills re-signed by the New York Giants. He was an exclusive rights free agent. Also joined the Giants in 2019, like Kaden Smith. Played 4 games this past season, got 1 start, and caught 2 passes for 17 yards. And Kyle, you and I both predicted that there was a good chance David Sills would make the 2020 roster until an injury ended his season. In 2021, he made the practice squad, and then he worked his way up to that 53-man roster. How much of an influence do you think Daniel Jones had in the re-signing of David Sills?
Obviously a big part, especially when you look at the injuries that have taken place the last couple of years for Daniel Jones. This has kind of been a guy that he's had to work with, I don't want to say by choice, but just because of the injury depth, whether it's been to a guy like Galladay falling out of the lineup, whether it was to Golden Tate last year, or Sterling Shepard last year, or all these other guys, Darius Slayton in and out of the lineup, Tony in and out of the lineup. He's kind of been fallen into the hands of Daniel Jones as kind of the only guy to necessarily have health and to be available because of the fact of bringing him off the practice squad. And Tom, this is your guy. This guy just doesn't seem to be falling out of the Giants organization, and they're bringing him in. And right now, at least at this point in time, depending upon what they do with maybe a Darius Slayton, he's probably wide receiver number 4 behind a Galladay, Tony, and a Shepard. So that this could be, I don't want to say a guy that's going to have impact on this team, but again, a reliable option and somebody that's been in the organization now for a couple of years.
Absolutely. And the continuity in that receiving room as well is going to be important. Before we get into our next topic, folks, want to plug our sponsor, BetUS, the #1 sportsbook, America's favorite, that is, serving customers for 25 plus years, where you can bet on all your favorite sports, and you can use our promo code below at JOIN125, 125% sign up bonus, up to $2,500. Bet on the go, anytime, anywhere on your mobile device. Get quick payouts. Enjoy that live betting, folks. Get the best lines out there. That's BetUS, where the game begins. Let's get into the next topic. And I'm happy Sterling Shepard is back in some regard. And it makes sense thinking about it. If the Giants were to cut him, they only would have saved $4.5 million. But the rework deal significantly decreases his cap. He was supposed to account for $12.5 million almost against the cap in 2022. This new deal only gives him a max value of $5.25 million. That's over $3 million less than what he was going to make, Kyle. So I'd imagine the Giants have saved at least $3.25 million against the cap with this rework deal.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of smart in the sense that, again, you're trying to build some continuity with Daniel Jones, especially if that's going to be the guy that you work with, especially in the wide receiver room, not only being the veteran presence there, but just the veteran presence in the fact that now he's the longest tenured Giant, now going to be on 7 years. And I think the Giants also, in restructuring this deal, they plan on the fact that, he just tore his left Achilles towards the end of December. So they probably plan on the fact that he's probably not going to be healthy. I would say so. An Achilles injury is probably a year-long kind of rehab. Maybe he'll be back by late October, maybe in November, something like that. But he's going to miss a lot of games. So they're kind of paying him for what he's going to be available wise. Because I don't expect, again, we've seen guys do it before. But come August, when we see the preseason, or come September, when we see that roll around, I don't think that he's going to be there. But to have this guy kind of be impacted and rejuvenated back into this offense come months like November and December, potentially, I'm happy to have him back. I know he's definitely a fan favorite. He's been one of my favorites since coming out of Oklahoma. I can't even believe that it's been 7 years. That's just absolutely incredible. But I'm happy to have him back. And again, the fact that they were able to make it work in the sense of saving more money doing this way versus releasing him only betters the organization, not in retaining a player that can add value to your roster and definitely to your offense, but in terms of adding cap space that you could then use to improve upon your team overall.
And that's a great point you brought up. A guy who, quite frankly, would have only saved the team an additional $1 million by cutting him based off of what we know about the details of this rework deal at this time. And to really be super accurate on it, Shepard will be entering his 7th year with the Giants in 2022. And he is the only player remaining from the Jerry Reese era. Fun fact. And I'm sure in a year or two or now we'll be saying who's left from the Dave Gettleman era.
That'll be a scary sight, especially because Gettleman just walked out the door just in the beginning of this year. But we'll see what happens.
Last topic of this video, Blake Martinez to remain with Big Blue. They've been trying to rework his deal for weeks now, coming off that torn ACL. Only played in 3 games last season. He was set to account for $14 million against the cap in 2022, heading into the final year of his 3-year deal he signed in 2020. Originally had a base salary of $8.5 million with a $5.5 million signing bonus that was prorated against the cap. And I think, Kyle, now we don't know the specifics of this Blake Martinez deal, but I think he would fit in great in Wink's new scheme. It did include linebackers like Martinez, but Baltimore paid a lot less for them than the premium that the Giants were currently paying Martinez.
Yeah, in a Wink Martindale defense, it's going to be a lot of blitzing, and the Giants need as many great tacklers and as many, not that he's the best guy to get to the quarterback in one of his better seasons that he's had, especially with the Giants, because I know that, I believe it was in 2017 with the Packers, he led the entire NFL in tackles, but with his first season with the Giants, he had a total of, I believe, 150 plus tackles, which was just amazing and really speaks to the detriment of his loss. Based on what we saw in this defense this past year, is that his impact was truly missed. Recorded 3 sacks in that year with 2 forced fumbles. So to have him back again, another great value guy, and to save more money this way by and then on top of the fact retaining him as a player, because again, a player of Blake Martinez's magnitude, a guy who can just pick up right where he left off, and hopefully he recovers from his injury nicely. He's young enough to, and I think that he will. But if he does so, a guy that instantly gives you 130 plus tackles on a season, that's something that every defense should be looking for. And now on kind of a bargain deal, I guess you would say, for what the value is there, on top of retaining the player based on what you're paying him, is just an all-around great feeling. Because I don't know that if the Giants were to release him, especially in that linebacking core, Tom, which as a Giants fan is very, very thin, I don't think you'd be able to replace his production in just one off season, even with the draft and free agency.
It's Blake and it's 2 7th-round picks from 2020. Tate Crowder and Carter Coughlin. That's all that's left. Now, without the Blake Martinez deal considered here, the Giants have saved almost $16 million in cap. So with a rough estimate, the Giants are now $5 to $6 million under the cap. So the Giants are not where they need to be, but they've gotten below the bar. So now the Giants need to continue to make some moves within the coming days. Obviously, there have been rumors about trading James Bradberry. That would free up $12 million in cap, which I think a lot of Giants fans want to see happen. I know some of the players in the secondary don't want to lose James Bradberry. I know Adoree Jackson has been very vocal about not losing Bradberry, but you hired Joe Shane, a guy who's likely going to rebuild this team in his way. And
Yeah.
some players aren't going to be happy. It's just how it is.
Well, Tom, let me ask you this question:
Mhm.
do the Giants retain $12 million if they release him, or if they trade him? If they trade him, won't the team just take on the entirety of that contract, or do the
Uh,
Giants still retain money? Because I know that if they release him, they save 12, but which I think is the likelihood of what's going to happen. I think that's kind of why we've seen this prolonged process of not being able to trade him, because
mhm.
people are waiting up until like the final hour of March 16th for the Giants to eventually just release him. That way, they don't have to give up any assets to get a pretty good corner. I mean,
Yeah.
in the years that he was with the Giants and the years that he was with the Panthers, it was a pretty solid corner. And I'm not saying he's not worth the money that he's being paid right now, but when you look at the Giants and they're just in such a cap hell, you got to make some cuts to some pieces in terms of the rebuild. Otherwise, I think they'd be retaining him as an option. But if they release him, I know that's 12, which will free up essentially, if you add that number on there, that's almost $28 million, which is great. But we'll see what furthermore happens, because again, this is a guy, and this is a secondary as well, that while they have some nice younger pieces, I don't know if you'd agree with this or not. He's probably the most solidified secondary piece that the Giants have at this point in time in terms of, or maybe you'd argue maybe a Logan Ryan, but I would say Bradbury more so, definitely in coverage at least.
Yeah. The one thing I will say, though, he doesn't fit Wink's scheme as much as
No, yeah.
players like Adoree Jackson and Aaron Robinson do. And now to answer your question, yes, releasing him will save $12+ million. Trading him would have as well, until Gettleman decided to restructure him last year. So the Giants are going to have to eat some of that money. Thank you to
Oh,
DG.
the
But
gift that keeps on
I,
giving.
of course, I believe they're going to save close to that number because it wasn't a huge restructure for Bradbury. So they're going to save close to that number. Joe Shane has saved about $16 million of the 40 that he wants to. And we will see what happens in the coming days. Kyle, thank you very much for joining me here today. Appreciate your time as always. And it's going to be a very, very interesting next couple days. Anything you wanted to add here on Big Blue as we head towards free agency?
Looking forward to it, Tom. I know something that I've said for years since being on Review and Preview. This is some of my favorite time of year. We got a lot of stuff going on. Obviously, football free agency. You got teams cutting money up. You got the NFL draft coming up in a month and a half from now. So a lot of great stuff going around. Very, very exciting time, and especially as we inch towards that March 16th date. But Tom, thank you as always for having me on. As always, a pleasure producing and making some content with you.
Absolutely, Kyle. Folks, without further ado, let's go Big Blue.